Welcome to Tradition. The theory of Brahman and Veda system of philosophy. Indian philosophy is not only engaging in theoretical discussion, it has also a practical utility. Indian philosophy seeks the way of freedom from suffering. We see in Indian philosophy liberation is the highest end of life. The self or Atman occupies center place in all Indian philosophic discussion because it is the self who suffers pain and wants to get freedom from that suffering. The ignorance regarding the real nature of self is the basic cause of bondage, samsara. Philosophy starts in India as an inquiry into the mystery of life and existence. Indian rishis or sages discovered that mind, body, sense organs are not true nature of man. Mind, body are changeable, mortal, but the true nature of man, that is called Atman, is unchanging and immortal. The Atman is the true nature of man. This Atman is the true knower, the true source of human knowledge and happiness. They also mention that Atman or self is pure consciousness. In this chapter I want to show that the concept of self of Advaita philosophy is transcendental by nature. Following the Indian tradition of the Rishis, Advaita Vedanta Samkara maintains that self is pure consciousness. This consciousness is not empirical, egoological, intentional and temporal. In this chapter I will try to show these claims about the self of Sankara. The general concept of Brahma or self of Advaita Vedanta Sankaracharya is the advocate of Advaita Vedanta. We find the central theme of Advaita philosophy in Mandukya Upanishad. The main book of Sankara is Brahma Sutra. The prime doctrine of Advaita philosophy Brahmasatyam Jagan Mithya, Jiva Brahmapana Apayarokama. In other words, Brahman is alone true, and this world of plurality is an error. The individual self is not different from Brahman. Therefore the Advaita Vedanta is an idealist philosophical concept which is at the same time, non-dual. According to Sankara, plurality is wrong, and this sense of plurality comes from the ignorance about the real nature of Brahman. This world has no existence apart from Brahman. As per Advaita Vedanta, Brahman is pure existence, pure consciousness and pure bliss. Brahman is the ultimate reality. There is no difference between Brahman and self or Atman. No one can deny the existence of self, because no one can proclaim that I am not. We can divide all our experiences in four categories, and these are awaking, Jagrata, dream, Swapna, deep sleep, Susupti and Turiya. In all the four stages we find the existence of self. As when we are in awaking and dream stage we are becoming conscious about something. We also feel the existence of ego or I, as the subject of conscious experiences. At the deep sleep stage, we say after awaking from sleep I slept well, so this stage also proves the existence of ego as subject of our consciousness. So we can say that there are self and objects in the first two levels. In the third level we can't find the object like first two stages, but the self is there. In this stage we find self as sit or consciousness, sat or existent, and ananda or bliss. In the final Turiya level saints realize the true nature of self. This Turiya stage is fully self-conscious enjoyment of bliss. We have already discussed that consciousness in its purest nature is also bliss or ananda. By the ordinary sources of knowledge we cannot know the existence of self, but no one can doubt it, because in every stage of our experiences we feel the existence of self. Yajnavalkya maintained that, through which everything is known, that cannot itself be made an object of knowledge, none can know the knower. This is self which is identical with pure consciousness in Brahman. According to the early prose of Upanishads, Atman is the principle of the individual consciousness and Brahman is the superpersonal ground of the cosmos. The Advaita Vedanta philosophy believe that self does not possess both physical and mental qualities. According to Advaita Vedanta, the real self is devoid of all mental and physical properties. According to this view, real self is nirguna. Saguna Brahman or Brahman with qualities is the result of superimposition. The Advaita Vedantins proclaim that the Aham does not signify the real self. Actually, Aham refers to individual or empirical self that is called in their language Vyavaharika Jiva. I always stands for consciousness falsely identified with inner organ or antakarana, antakaranatatminokatanya. This empirical self is not real self. The empirical self is locus of pramatrava, knowerhood, kartrava, agenthood. But these properties actually do not belong to the real self. These are belonging to Antakarana or inner organ. Thus this complex of consciousness and inner organ is referred to by Aham or I. This I possess different qualities, knowledge, happiness, etc. So we have seen that according to Advaita Vedanta reality is one, and that is Brahman or Atman. This Brahman or Atman is different from inner self in each individual being. We see in the Upanishads the Atman refers to pure consciousness. This pure consciousness is not empirical consciousness. This is trans-empirical consciousness, and it also forms the basis of the empirical individual being. As the real self or Brahman is trans-empirical consciousness, it is therefore beyond words to explain. The real nature of self is unknowable and unexplainable to us. So actually the Brahman or self is quality-less, nirguna, limitless, ashan, shapeless, nirakaro, and unperceivable, ajarishya. But we use three concepts to attain the nature of Brahman or self. This is called Svarupa Lakshana. It declares the actual nature of Brahman or self. Three concepts are Sitla consciousness, Sat or existent, and Ananda or bliss. From these three concepts we can say that whatever is conscious, existent and bliss, that is called Brahman or Atman. Consciousness and being are inseparable. When someone says, I am here, he or she is actually saying, I am conscious of my being here. His or her consciousness does not differ from his or her being. Therefore Sat is Chit, Chit is Sat. Bliss, Ananda, is the highest freedom that we can attain. Therefore, the prime reality is Sat Chit Ananda. Brahman or self is very peculiar in nature. This is very impartial in nature. This is not committed to any particular world, but it is the basis of all actual and possible worlds. So we can mention here that the Brahman or self of Advaita Vedanta is very closer to the concept transcendental self. As we have seen in the first chapter of my thesis that transcendental self is non-empirical, the basis of actual and possible worlds, and identical with pure consciousness. I will consider it latter, in my last section of this chapter. According to Advaita Vedanta's consciousness is not a property of Brahman or self but its very nature. Brahman is often described as neti or not this, not this. So we cannot properly explain the nature of Brahman. It is Satchidananda or infinite truth, infinite consciousness, and infinite bliss. As Brahman is one, so it is free from any kind of differentiation. When Atman is reflected on avidya or ignorance, Atman becomes Jiva, a living being with a body and senses. The concept of Jiva is truth in the pragmatic level. But actually Brahman or real self is devoid of all bodies and sense organs. In the transcendental level, only the Atman, or Brahman exists, and that is ultimate true. Brahman Jnana, Vritajnana and Saksajnana, we have already discussed that is the reality is one, and that is called Brahman. Brahman is defined in Vedanta as being consciousness bliss. The Brahman or self is knowledge as such. It cannot be object of knowledge because there cannot be a knower of Brahman. If we say that Brahman is its own knower, then it will provide a contradiction, because in that case Brahman will be the agent of knowledge and it will also be the object of knowledge. As the Brahman is indivisible and partless entity, it cannot also be hold that the self is knower to some person and it is object of knowledge to other person. Since we know a partless entity cannot hold a duality form, the knower and the known in the same time. So we can say Brahman or self of Advaita Vedanta is knowledge as such. When we say that Brahman is knowledge as such, then we accept that knowledge as a metaphysical entity. Brahman Jnana is only reality. Through the knowledge of Brahman we achieved to liberation. Due to ignorance the Jiva wrongly imagines that he is separate from Brahman. Brahman Jnana or knowledge of Brahman remove this ignorance and Jiva takes place in his own nature Sat, Chit, Ananda Svarupa, or in other words after removing the ignorance, through the Brahman Jnana, Jiva takes place in Brahman. Brahman Jnana or knowledge of Brahman is different from ordinary knowledge, Vritti and Saksan, because in ordinary knowledge there is the knowledge of something which is different from the knower. For this reason the ordinary knowledge is limited and so consumable. But Brahman Jnana is eternal, there is no difference between the knower and the known. It is the knowledge of unity of knower and known, and it is the pure and infinite knowledge. So in Braham Jnana, Braham is the knower and Braham is the known. The ordinary knowledge or jnana is neither vritti of the internal organ or antakarana nor a seksan, rather of both, that is the vritti is inspired by the saksan jnana, contains two elements. One is eternal element. This eternal element is consciousness which is Braham. Another element is contingent element that stands for the changing vrittis that appear and disappear. As the eternal element, consciousness is associated with vrittis, so consciousness only seems to change, but actually the eternal element or consciousness is not affected by it. In view of Advaita Vedanta, cognition is nothing but consciousness. Consciousness can only illuminate object. Perceptual cognition is also a consciousness qualified by vritti. Antakarana is constituted by 5 physical elements, although tejas predominates it, which is the reason for its unstable and changing character. Vritti or mode is known as the activity of antakarana. Saksan means observer. It refers to the pure awareness that witnesses the world but does not get involved. In other words, we can say Saksan witnesses all thoughts, words and deeds without interfere with them or affected by them. The Advaita school admits 2 kinds of Saksan, one is Jiva Saksan and another is Isvara Saksan, and both Saksans are consciousness only. But due to upadhis or limiting adjuncts, consciousness are classified in different categories. The consciousness with the adjunct Maya is called Isvara Saksan and the consciousness with the adjunct inner organ is Jiva Saksan. So we can say Saksan is consciousness, but due to upadhis or limiting adjuncts, Maya, inner organ, it is classified in Jiva Saksan and Isvara Saksan. Thus as per Advaita school, Saksan can also be a wrong cognition. For this reason Saksan Jnana is different from Brahman Jnana, which is real and eternal. Braham is pure consciousness which is not delimited by any adjuncts or upadhis. We have discussed Saksan is consciousness. Saksan Jnana is the constant element of knowledge. It is different from Vritti Jnana because Vritti Jnana is empirical knowledge, which is not constant but changeable. Also, all states of the antakarana are necessarily illuminated by Saksan. Saksan is passive observer of the antakarana, the inner organ. The unity of passive Saksan and active antakarana is real for any practical purpose or ordinary knowledge. Jiva or empirical self is the complex form of Saksan and antakarana. We can also say if Saksan is associated with vritti or modification of inner organ, so the Saksan Jnana is relative by nature. Therefore Saksan as such is not the same as Braham. The Vritti Jnana is a form of modification. When the inner organ reaches to the objects through the external sense organs, then vritti take place. The Advaita Vedanta philosophy holds that the consciousness delimited by the vritti is perceptual cognition. Vritti Jnana is different from Brahman Jnana, because Vritti Jnana is empirical by nature and it is changeable. Brahman Jnana is eternal, it is not an empirical knowledge. Vritti Jnana is also different from Brahman Jnana because Vritti Jnana is a process of ordinary knowledge, it is not a metaphysical entity, but when we say that Braham is knowledge as such, then we accept that knowledge as a metaphysical entity. Vritti Jnana has content. It has a subject to which it discloses and an object which is exposed by it. At the time of liberation that the complex unity of Saksan and antakarana disintegrates and antakarana combines itself in its cause, Maya, and accordingly Saksan loses its Saksanhood and becomes Braham indeed. The nature of consciousness, the Upanishads say that Braham or self is pure consciousness, Prajnan and Brahma. Here I want to discuss about the real nature of consciousness. Actually the pure consciousness is one. But due to upadhis or limiting adjuncts, consciousness are classified in different categories. These different categories of consciousness are Brahmchaitanya or absolute consciousness, Isvarachaitanya or cosmic consciousness, Jivachaitanya or individual consciousness, and Saksichaitanya or indwelling consciousness. The philosophy of Advaita Vedanta mentions that there is an ultimate entity of this universe, called Braham Chaitanya. We have already mentioned that this entity, Braham, is absolute existence, Sat, pure consciousness, Sit, and bliss, Ananda. This ultimate standpoint or Braham or pure consciousness does not turn into this world, it only appears to have done so. To explain the creation of the universe, Advaita Vedanta introduces the concept of Isvarachaitanya. When Braham is united with Maya, This is treated as the creator, preserver and destroyer of this universe. This type of consciousness, composite with Maya, is called as Svarakaitanya. Actually Brahma is not creator, preserver and destroyer of this world. Brahma is not qualified, but due to his Svarakaitanya non-qualified Brahma converts into qualified Brahma. The third category of consciousness is human consciousness or Jivakaitanya. Due to this consciousness Jiva or human being seems himself different from Brahma. But actually Jiva is identical with pure consciousness or Brahma. A passage in the Mundaka Upanishad describes the relationship of our true self with the empirical self, Jivakaitanya. Like two birds of golden plumage, inseparable companions, the individual self and the immortal self are perched on the branches of the self-same tree. The former tastes of the sweet and bitter fruits of the tree, the latter, tasting of neither, calmly observes. The individual self, deluded by forgetfulness of his identity with the divine self, bewildered by his ego, grieves and is sad. But when he recognizes the worshipful Lord as his own true self, and beholds his glory, he grieves no more. Vedanta upholds the real nature of every human being as the luminous self which is associated with the mind as the one looker, or witness or saksi. In the case of saksi the mind is a limiting adjunct. Saksi is witnessing consciousness uncontaminated by witnessed mind. The philosophy of Advaita Vedanta mentions that a conscious entity getting identified with the limiting inner entity, mind, is jiva as reflected consciousness. The conscious entity just witnessing the limiting mind is Saksikaitanya. According to Advaita Vedanta Saksikaitanya is reflected consciousness and is more commonly known as the Ahamkara or ego. It has a notion of I am the enjoyer, I am the knower etc. This witness consciousness or Saksikaitanya is the basic presupposition of all knowledge. So we have seen that pure conscious is really one. But due to limiting adjuncts or upadhis this is classified in different categories. Actually the consciousness of Advaita Vedanta is undifferentiated, non-temporal, non-spatial, non-intentional and self-illuminating. 5 level of consciousness. We have already discussed that Brahma or superconsciousness is real and one in world superimposition on it is Brahma or superconsciousness. Here we can trace out the 5 level of consciousness of Advaita Vedanta through which Advaita Vedanta asserts that the ultimate vision of life is to observe one ultimate or supreme consciousness, in all places and in all beings. In the lowest level of consciousness, a human being dwells at the physical level dwelling on his bodily needs. In the second level of consciousness he lives on the activities of vital force body or PRN which work within the body. In the third level of consciousness a human being dwells on the mental activities like reading, thinking etc. A human being lives on the utmost spiritual truths of existence above ordinary human experience in the fourth level of consciousness. At the zenith point he feels his union with omnipresent universal consciousness and sank in unspeakable happiness. This is called level of superconsciousness which is objectless, egoless, non-intentional and purely metaphysical existence. It is measureless, immortal life, sat. Infinite knowledge without any bondage ensures endless bliss of freedom or mukti. So in this way the Advaita Vedanta shows that this ultimate or supreme consciousness is one but present everywhere in all beings. The consciousness of Vedanta is non-intentional. Samkara declares that intentionality is metaphysically false. This view is different from Husserl. Husserl mentions that consciousness is always intentional. The meaning of intentionality is that consciousness needs consciousness of something. So if we admit the theory of intentionality then we have to admit that consciousness goes to object moreover consciousness and that said object is different from consciousness. But we have mentioned that Advaita Vedanta declares that reality is one. This reality is Brahma, or self and that is identical with consciousness. So we can say consciousness is one. So there is no question of intentionality of consciousness, because there is no object, apart from consciousness, to which consciousness can move. Samkara believes that intentionality is superimposed upon non-intentional consciousness. According to Advaita tradition consciousness is not temporal, it is beyond time. Samkara also holds the view that pure consciousness is not egological. Ego or I is applicable to empirical consciousness. When consciousness falsely identified with inner organ due to ignorance, then it is referred by I or ego. This is called empirical self. This empirical self is not real. Actually, the empirical consciousness is moving, changeable. But pure consciousness is not temporal, it is unmoving, undifferentiated. So my observation is that there is a difference between Husserl and Sankara regarding the nature of consciousness, and self. Sankara also says that this pure consciousness is non-egological. Pure consciousness is one and free from any kind of difference, beta. There is no subject-object difference in it. Sankara states that no proof is required to maintain the view that the subject and the object, which are signified by the terms asmad and yasmad, that is the self and the not self, are opposed to each other like light and darkness. So they cannot be identified. In the same way their respective attributes also cannot be identified. It is however quite natural to differentiate the two entities, that is the subject and the object, and their respective attribute owing to wrong knowledge and carry on our mundane activities. There is nothing but pure consciousness which is non-intentional, egoless and cannot be seen. This consciousness is the foundational reality and all actual and possible worlds are meaningful for this. But we can say in some context the consciousness of the Advaita Vedanta is egological and intentional. In awakening, Jagrata, dream, Swapna, and deep sleep, Susupti, stage we see the all pain, suffering is due to consciousness becoming entangled in the hopeless causal chain of samsara, the empirical world. This includes both acknowledgement of one's consciousness to an ego or I, and also acknowledges the attachment of consciousness to an object. As when we are in a waking and dream stage we are becoming conscious about something. So as my thinking at that consciousness is treated as intentional. We also feel the existence of ego or I, as the subject of conscious experiences. At the deep sleep stage, we say after awaking from sleep I slept well, so this stage also established the existence of ego as subject of our consciousness. So we see that at the first two level of experiences, awaking and dream stage, consciousness is egological and intentional, but at the third stage of experience, deep sleep, it is not intentional, but egological. However, we have to keep in mind that at the stage of Turiya the consciousness is free from intentionality and also free from ego attachment. This Turiya stage is fully self-conscious enjoyment of bliss. We have already discussed that consciousness in its purest nature is also bliss or ananda. This consciousness is self-luminous. It is not adventitious quality of the self. It is nothing but the self. The self is not knower of knowledge as well as object of knowledge, it is knowledge, sit, as such. By the ordinary sources of knowledge we cannot know the existence of self but no one can doubt it. As in every stage of our experiences we can never doubt about the existence of self. Yajnavalkya maintained that, through which everything is known, that cannot itself be made an object of knowledge, none can know the knower. Sankara also gives a foundation character of knowledge or consciousness. According to him knowledge of the object is not possible without consciousness, for the reason that every object derives its existence and manifestation from this ultimate principle, namely consciousness. This consciousness is ultimate principle of revelation of the world of objects. It is the light which manifests all objects and their relations between the objects. It is the center of the whole world. It comprises the objects, the senses and the mind, and it is neither inside or nor outside, it is altogether a mass of knowledge. This is the center theory of the self of Advaita philosophy. According to this philosophy consciousness occupies the central place of the universe, because all objects get their meaning and significance to the relations in which they stand to the self. This self is consciousness itself. Lastly we may present Sankara's Advaita philosophy in brief following this way. 1. According to Sankara reality is one and that is called Brahma. So the Advaita Vedanta is an idealist monism and non-dualism. 2. The terms Brahma, consciousness and self or Atman are identical. 3. As per Advaita Vedanta Brahma is pure consciousness, pure existence and pure bliss. These are not properties of Brahma, but these are very nature of Brahma. 4. Self is self-luminous or svaprakasa, but other objects are paraprakasas these objects manifested by others. The self manifests itself and the other objects are manifested by the light of self or consciousness. 5. According to the Advaita Vedanta, consciousness is also one, it is eternal. It is free from any kind of difference. 6. The self or consciousness is knowledge itself. 7. The self or consciousness is the ultimate foundational reality, because all actual and possible worlds are meaningful for this principle. 8. We cannot explain the real nature of self with the help of ordinary language. Thanks for watching.